In this next part, we focus on adding a density map and then add our different clump layers to the hair so we get an initial overview of how the hair looks, and we can better judge it when we change and adjust and refine our groom. So let's start by adding a density map. When we select the hair generation, we got our density here, and we can override it with a texture. Let's browse for a texture. I got maps here, and then I got fur density, and I pick my TIFF map, which I got. Let me quickly get the expression here. What we need, we want to work with UDIMs, so instead of $F, we want to use percentage UDIM d.tiff, and that will now use all our UDIM tiles which we have on the map. So you can already see that on the nose and the lips and so on, we got a different density now. Let me quickly show it to you. Actually, if it would open. So I got my map here, and what you can see is we have some more density on the nose parts and on the ears and around the eyes, and less density in general on the body. Like on a body, I reduced the default value to 0.5, and then we have like a higher value of 1 and so on the nose parts. Let's go back to Houdini. You can just use that map if you want to, or you can paint your own map. And now let's adjust some of the values. Since we have in general less density, we just increase it here to fit to something we want to use. So we have a nice dense hair now in some areas of the ears and so on, and we try to use that. For now it's all too flat and we cannot really see what it looks like. So let's add some clumping here. To add clumping, we could use the button from the shelf here, clump guides. So when we do that, just hit the clump guides button, it bakes a little bit to add this operator. Give it a second. Instead of just using the shelf button, we could also just hit tab and type in clump, and we would find the same node like here. So if I type clump, you see we got a hair clump, and it would do the same. So what we can see now is that the clumps are quite small. If we increase the size here to something like 0.5, you can see that now we have some nicer, bigger clumps. Let's go through some values of the clumping here. First of all, what you see is the blend. That's just the overall blend of the clump. Then we got a size. Then we got some options here. Search beyond clump radius. That means if the clump size, that's our radius, it starts searching beyond that radius. Only clump within existing clumps can be turned off for that first layer, because we only got one clump. Where this is useful is when you now create another clump node later on with smaller clumps. When this is turned on, it will only create clumps within those clumps which we already got. If it is turned off, it will just do the same as it does now. It will generally create that clumps and will ignore what it already got here. The crossover rate is that the hair will just cross between certain clumps and create a more like randomized feeling of the hair. So for this first layer, I just keep it off. Then we got here extrude and blend or linear blend. What that does is extrude and blend tries to not have the same hair length for every hair, but it just clumps towards those curves and keeps the length a little bit. Like you can see here, you got the longer hair and then you got shorter ones here because it does not extend the length. If you put it to linear, it tries to move each hair points, like the points, the last one to the tip of the clump, and then just tries to extend all hair to fit to the clump curve. Alright, for our first layer I leave it at linear blend, and then for the clump profile, that is just the profile of the overall clump. So let's say we want to have less tight clumps, then we just change our profile, and we can also say, okay, let's randomize the tips of the clumps a little bit so we don't have like such a sharp tip but some randomization. And let me change that even more. And now to have a better visualization, I would like to add some color before we continue adjusting our clumps. So what we do is we hit tab and then we type color, and we got this color node which we add. Just connect it and turn it on and select the color. So now all our hair is red, but that doesn't help us. What we would like to do is we would like to have a ramp from the root of the hair to the tip. To do so, we change the color type, and hope it doesn't crash now. To ramp from attribute. Let me quickly save this file as file number 3 clump setup. Alright, so why doesn't it do anything? Because we do not have an attribute we can use in the ramp. For that to use, we need to create some sort of UV value for each hair. Let's add a texture node, UV texture, and connect it in between. What this node can do now is here in the texture type, we can say average spline, and now it creates a UV value along each spline. And instead of vertex, we want to use points on the actual hair. So we still got nothing to use in attribute, because if you use UV, it's a two-dimensional attribute like an array, but we want to have only the value from root to tip. To change that, we add an attribute wrangle node and add it after our UV texture. So in the attribute wrangle node, what we do is we create a new attribute which is a float and which is called U, and the value of this new attribute is our UV, but only the first array value, so only the U. If you would use 1 in here, it would get us the V value of that UV. Alright, points is correct. So let's go back to our color and now use that attribute we just created called U and change our ramp here. And what we can see now is if we turn off our shading, so it doesn't use the material but actually use the color from our ramp, you can see we can adjust our ramp, and when you see from the back here, we see that we get a black color, and then to the tips we get a white color. So let's change this white to something light brownish, a little bit in the greenish area, so it fits to our reference image. And let's say we want to have more of the root colors, and that's good. We can now see how the clumps look like because we have a more precise feedback. Let's feed this into our hairs and clean up a little bit our graph here. So we move that in here. And we can actually move that out here. All right. So to clean it up more, we do the coloring before we do anything else, like before we do clumps or so on. So let's move the color here and move the clump below this. And let's continue from here. Now the first part we want to do for the clump is we want to actually paint where it is used. Like we do not want to have clumping here in this area like you can see here for the nose. To do that, we can select our clump and then we have here like the blend, and we can say okay, for the blend value to specify where we use the clump, we use the skin attribute again. It is by default called clump mask. We want to call it clump mask big because that's our first layer, and we want to call this one here hair clump big, like our clump node itself. Then just hit the paint button and it will add our attribute nodes again for painting. So here you go. We got our nodes. We can again create something like this here. So we got a nicer path for our lines. And we can start painting here. If we enable the painting node and then go into this one, set it to infrared, set the foreground to white, the background to black, change our settings, and first of all we want to set everything to 0, so we don't have any clumping anywhere at all. And now we want to start paint where we actually have clumping. So we want to have clumping here. Let me increase the opacity. We want to have clumping here in this area. We want to have some clumping here. Paint some something on the outside of where we actually have hair, just so we have some transition area. And maybe when I turn this down again, we want to add also some clumping in this area. And inside the ear, as we saw in the reference, there are those nice curly clumps here. So I want it a little bit inside the ear. And on this bottom part here. So that's good. Now when we turn on the clump again, we should see that we now have only clumping in this area where we painted it. So here we got some nice clumping here and inside the ear. Let me get from a different scene which I already prepared, let me get the painted attribute which I painted there. So I just copy and pasted the paint node which I have on a different scene, and we can look at what I painted here. So I have some painting here on the bottom. I also painted the body because I just reused that attribute by copy and pasting like I did it now. And basically we want to, instead of what I just created before, we want to use what I copy and pasted. So we can just connect this here, delete the ones created before, and then we can rename those to something. And our hair clump just takes over that copied attribute because it got the same name and everything works as expected. So about the clump values, we want to introduce some more clumping. Let me move this down here. So we got more space, save this. And now add more clumps. So we add another hair clump node and we copy and paste that one. And let's name this. So this one is now called hair clump. mid and hair clumps more. And for those here, it's important that we turn on only clump within existing clumps. So the newly created clumps get created in the ones we already have. If you want that. If not, we just turn it off. All right, let's connect this. So we got here, we got the skin. Here we got the skin with DB. The same we do here. Let me cancel it. All right, here we go. And connect this to our hairs. That's our basic setup which we're gonna have. We're gonna have this 3 layers of clumping. Before we continue with those here on the bottom, let me start with adding some curliness or frizz to our clumps and actually change how they are distributed. A clump node got a 4th input, which is called custom clump curves. So instead of only using that Voronoi-based clump size, which creates our clumps, we can use inputs for the clumps. And with inputs, what I mean is, let us get a new hair gen node, which will generate hair within our graph here. Let's see what the inputs are. That's the rest skin, the guides, and the animated skin. So for the rest skin and animated skin, we just use the same. We use our skin here, and we use our skin here. And then for our hair, we use our guides here. Then we move this down and we can enable that. And what it, let me quickly hit escape and change the default density because it's a 1000 by default, which is a lot. All right, it looks like it didn't create anything, but that is because when we go to attributes, the width is just so small that we don't see anything. So let's just increase this, and you can see that is what it created. Now for the density, we add some more, and for the group, we can say, again, like group head only. Let me see if there's anything else I want to change. I don't think so. So that looks nice for now. Those will be our clump inputs now. So if we feed that into our custom clump curves and enable the clumps, you see that they change, they become bigger. And this is because now they are driven through that scattering we do here. So if we increase the density, our clumps become smaller. If we reduce the density, they become bigger. Let me see what values I used in my previous scene so we get a good understanding of what works out. I used a density of 2, so that's fine. For the relax iteration, I used less because we want a little bit of more natural clumps and not so evenly distributed. And now for the influence radius and so on, we have a super small influence, so we want to increase that so our guides get actually influence our clumps correctly. And then for the max guide count to influence my clumps, I use 6. And actually did not use grow unguided hairs. All right, that's it. Now we want to add some frizz effect or curling to our clumps. How we can do that is by adding, since we have hair here now, we can use all operations we use also on our main hair, we can use on the input for our clumps. So let's type frizz here, and that shows us the guide process frizz, so we can just put that down, add that in here. Oh, and actually, it messed up a little bit, so let me get a new one and just manually connect it. We have our guides here, and that is our skin, so we can use that here. And we also use the skin VDB from here and reconnect that here. So now when we look at our guide process, we can now, when we turn up the amplitude, see the frizz here. And when we reduce the frequency, we can create less scraggly but more curly behavior. Something like this maybe. So we get some nice curly stuff going on here. And when we now use that as input for our clumps, we're also going to have a little bit more curly clumps, I would think. So let's increase that. And let me quickly check here. Did that now do anything? Yes, but it didn't really do what we expected to do. Oh, never mind. I need to check here because here we got less clumping, so the effect is less visible. So here we see that we now got, when I turn this off, you see we got this frizz effect in here. So let me turn down the amplitude a little bit again, like this, and let me change some of this value here. We add some crossover to break up our clumps. And now what we want to do is we add some fractal clumping within our clumps. So let's see what values we could use here. Like for the size reduction, the goal feedback. Goal feedback is just that it keeps the clumps. If we turn it to 0, it will lose all clumps. So the tightness reduction is that, like when it's 0, we still got like this full tight clumps as we had it before, and the higher the value is, the more the clump will be randomized a little bit. For the iterations, what is important to do is to set this to skin attribute and use the same attribute you used for the blend. There are some issues if you don't do that, that in some areas where there is no clumping, there happen some weird things. So by default, I just always use my clump mask, which I use for the strength of the clump where it applies. I also use it for the iterations attribute. All right. So now, since we use fractal clumping, we can change the size of our fractal clumps through the clump size. So if we set this to 1, the fractal clumps are smaller. And it's like we get like 5 iterations of clumps within that big clump created with the fractal, and the clump size itself changes how that looks like. For the stray amount, I keep that at 0. We don't have stray here right now. That would just be like the flyaway we mentioned. Also in clumps, if you turn that on, you're gonna have hair which just goes in different directions. And like if I turn up the stray amount, now if you see here, like you got hairs going around here. If you turn that to 0, we don't have that many. All right, let's continue with our medium clumps. So we want to break up the clumps we already had into more detailed clumps, so by adding another layer. Let me get something I prepared already in a different scene, where we have attributes and so if I copy this in here, let's connect this here. Sorry, let's connect this here. And we can delete the ones we created here. All right. So what we need to connect again is the guides to what we already had. Then we connect the guides here. Here the skin is connected with that attribute. So we need to get the skin from here. And we need to output our guides here. Now let's just move this in our flow here. Move them here. And also connect like the skin VDB. So if we check out what I actually painted in the other scene, is the clump mask medium for our second layer clump is, as you can see here, it applies everywhere where it's red, and then on the nose it has less influence. And if you go to the medium clump here, let's check out the values here, what it does. So it breaks up our clumps, as you can see here, in nice curly smaller clumps. So let me go back to our hair clump big and now to our hair clump medium, and you see we get some additional detail in there. How does that work? We also use fractal clumping again in this clumping node, and otherwise we just use some additional values here. Like for this one we say extrude and blend. Like here we used the linear blend, so each hair gets the length of each clump input source, and in this one we use extrude and blend and say don't make hair shorter when it is longer than a clump, so we keep some sort of randomization. Once we are happy with our medium clumps, we then go on and add another layer of painting for the tiny small clumps, where you can see that's like the influence we use here. And then let me go into our hair clump small node, check out what we got here, and so here we just add another layer of clumping. What you got here, clump size attribute, we can remove that to no override. We don't want that. So we only want the mask for now. So those are our clumps which we use. And now, based on that, since we got enough feedback in the viewport, how everything looks like, we can now continue and refine our groom. On top of our clumps, we might also add initial frizz to our fur. So how we do that is we just type frizz and get a guide process. Let me rename that node and just go somewhere so we hide the hair. Copy this guy here 3 times and rename them. So we name it to frizz clamps big, copy that name, rename this to frizz clamps medium, oh my typo, medium, and frizz clamps small. And now we add that. Actually, this gets added here. The frizz clamp medium gets added here, and the frizz clamp small gets added here. So the idea is that after each clamp we have, like after our hair clamp big, we can add a frizz. It's baking. So that frizz, we want to lower the frequency and higher the amplitude. And you can see we added frizz here now. Basically, I only want to use that frizz, like the amplitude here. I want to use a skin attribute, and I actually want to use my clamp mask big. So that frizz is only applied within my clamps and not on some other hair where I don't use clamping. Now the same, once we add our hair clamp medium, we can say now we want to also add some frizz on our clamps we just created here, like on the hair, not on the clamps but on the hair. To do that, again, we say for the amplitude we use a skin attribute, and we just use the clamp mask medium. We could also just paint our a new attribute which only controls that frizz node, but for now we just use some values here, check out what's going on. So if we change that to 50 again, let's see where it actually changes. So you can see there is a lot of frizz going on now. So we reduce it a little bit, increase the frequency to have some lower. Let's go back to this one. Look at the frizz. What's going on here? So here it's kind of straight. Then we add this here. And it adds some frizz. So, and for the small one, we want to do the same. We want to say skin attribute, clamp mask small, have a little higher frequency, like 5, and amplitude of 0.1. So we see it here. Go to this one, and that's basically our initial clamping which we will use.